Our scripture today comes from the Acts of the Apostles, from the New Revised Standard Version, chapter 9, verses 36 through 43. Let's listen to the word. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went to them, and when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and the widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. And so ends the reading of the word.
Thank you, choir. Beautiful, beautiful, an apt word for today. Some of you have asked me how in the world this scripture, the latest in our post-Easter sermon series on how Easter can lead to new life in us, how it possibly connects to the topic of new life in our attitudes towards violence. Fair question. But I do believe that this short and intriguing story from the book of Acts is, in fact, both something that encapsulates something very true about our lives and can also suggest to us how God might want us to respond to violence. The key to doing this lies in the last two words of the story. A tanner. Meanwhile, Peter stayed for some time in Joppa with a certain Simon, a tanner. Do you know anything about the tanning of leather? It's a nasty and vile business. I will spare your stomach the details, but suggest that you look it up if you want on Wikipedia. But don't do so after you've eaten. It's pretty gruesome. Moreover, the very art of tanning leather is, of course, only possible due to violence and death. It reminds me of that hoary old joke about the pig and the chicken who decided to open a restaurant together. "What shall we name it?" the pig asked. "How about ham and eggs?" said the chicken. Whereupon the pig responded, "I don't think so. After all, for you, that would be a contribution. For me, that would be a sacrifice." The point, it is indeed inescapable that you and I live in a complex world where our lives are made possible at times by the sacrifice of other lives. No matter how we may try to avoid that truth or pretty it up with clever packaging, it is simply the case that death and violence are part and parcel of our lives. But at the same time, there is an opposite truth from the other side of this scripture. Peter's reviving Tabitha from death. Now, I don't want to talk about the mechanics of how this could have happened. I'm not interested in either somehow proving it really did happen, or on the contrary, trying to explain how she wasn't really dead but just seemed to be. You can find hundreds of articles on both topics if you wish. But I think that such discussions miss the point. For you see, the more important point is that what Peter did there is the very same thing that God is always doing. And that is seeking to bring goodness out of hurt and pain and even death. And that's what reminded me of that story about, and I'm going to share it again, Mr. Rogers' best advice passed along from his mother when there were those terrible or sad things in the news. My mother would say to me, Mr. Rogers recalls, look for those helpers. You'll always find people helping. And to this day, he continued, I remember those words and I'm comforted by them, realizing there are so many helpers, so many caring people. In other words, our scripture this morning is, I think, a kind of compact summation of the dual nature of our lives. We cannot escape the fact that our lives are formed in the context of both violence and vulnerability, both harshness and healing, both death and life. there is both goodness and destructiveness at work in our lives. And so, in turn, as I have so often said, that Scripture comes to us both as a description of our lives, but also comes as a challenge to us. And that challenge this morning is for each of us to decide how and where we will fall on that scale of violence versus peaceableness, of using our actions to harm versus being one of those helpers that Mr. Rogers spoke of. And yet, it is not a simple or easy thing to think about, is it? After all, even the most peaceable of people have sometimes decided that violence is the only option. The great German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his early life, was a pacifist, committed to nonviolence. Yet, by the end of his life, he came to the conclusion that in the face of Hitler's horrific evils, he had to conspire to try to assassinate him. On the other hand, even those who might be prone to use violence have sometimes decided for peaceableness. Martin Luther King Jr. talked candidly about how his first reaction in the face of Sheriff Bull Connor's dogs and fire hoses set upon women and children was indeed to respond with violence himself, and yet he made the choice for a nonviolent response. For the first 3 centuries after Jesus' life, Christians almost universally believed that Jesus wanted them to be pacifists. And so they refused to carry any weapons, and they refused to fight for the Romans when they were drafted, and that was one of the most important reasons why they were persecuted so fiercely by the empire. No, it's not as easy as we sometimes might think. We live in a world that is not yet the kingdom. And so you and I will always have to grapple both faithfully and yet imperfectly in knowing how violence can legitimately be a part of a Christian's life, but at the same time without blessing every form of violence as legitimate. It's why the church for centuries has said that while war may sometimes be inevitable, it must always be fought within the bounds of what are called the just war rules, which include not indiscriminately killing the innocent. It's why we want our police to have the tools of violence, and yet expect them, as every good police officer will tell you, not to be cavalier in their use, and why police are trained in diffusing conflict as a first reaction, not escalating it. It's why we want and need, as again any good police officer will agree, we want and need to root out those who do forget these things and who do discriminate against and hurt those whom they are supposed to protect. No, it's not easy. It is not easy. And so back to our question, what does the reality of life lived in an imperfect world, a world that's not yet the kingdom, a world where you and I are inescapably part of both life and death, peaceableness and violence, what does all that mean for how we should respond to that world, and how our words and our actions can manifest the new life that God is calling us to? Well, let me offer 2 suggestions for how we do so. First, let us stop using the word and the metaphor of war to describe absolutely everything we're opposed to. As a society, we have had a war on poverty, a war on drugs, a war on illiteracy, a war on childhood malnutrition, and so on and so on. Such a metaphor, though, is the enemy of nuance and thoughtfulness. The whole concept of war includes with it the idea of defeating, destroying, decimating, and therefore is inescapably violent. But it's not always helpful. The war on drugs led to mandatory sentencing, which has had a disastrous effect on minority communities in our country and stripped from thoughtful and compassionate judges the power to respond to crime with creativity and nuance in ways that would definitely hold folks accountable and yet leave room for transformation. You see, when the notion of war becomes the first and often the only thing we think of in the face of a social problem, we're likely to forget that the prophet Isaiah called for us to reason together, not make war together. As the old saying goes, if the only tool that you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. Likewise, if the only tool you have is war, then every social, moral, and religious problem looks like a battle to be fought and won. And that inevitably and thoughtlessly escalates the violence around us and the violence that gets in your head. Second, I would invite you to join me in asking our leaders to stop talking so much about fighting. When Ted Cruz and Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton all talk virtually nonstop about how they are fighting for you, I want to say no. What I want you to do is try to think well, discern well, use your experience and your moral judgments and your principles to offer ideas that can upbuild the common good of this country. Don't just talk about fighting for me. You see, the more that fighting is the only motif in our civic life, and the more it invades our heads, the less able we are to deal with those things that require more than just our boxing gloves. And the more we tend to reduce others to dehumanized straw men at which we sling over simple slogans. Television and the internet thrive on such oversimplifications, but that does nothing to upbuild, in St. Paul's words, our life together as a people. As conservative political commentator and evangelical religious leader Michael Gerson says, quote, "The standards and values of reality television, the exaggerated feuds, the personal vilification, the expletives, have invaded the political realm. And they've also invaded our heads and our spirits, haven't they? Making it that much harder to try to faithfully navigate how, as Christians, we respond to the complex problems and opportunities before us. The continual use of war and fighting metaphors by our culture worries Mr. Gerson. He calls it, quote, "the loss of good manners." and says that such manners affirm that we are all part of the same community and that everyone, he says, is due a certain minimal amount of respect. Poor manners, he goes on to say, in contrast, brings about the dehumanization of individuals and groups. And that certainly does not lead to new life and transformed life, but to exactly the opposite. It does not lead to you and I being persons of nuance and thoughtfulness, but instead persons who are more and more calloused and less inclined to see the people we live with in this world as fellow children of God. Throughout the scriptures, in both testaments, there is repeated testimony that words are incredibly powerful. That words, as one philosopher puts it, make our worlds. And that the words we use can therefore either make us more prone to the violence of demonizing and dehumanizing or not. Nowhere is that more clearly stated in the Bible than in these haunting lines from the book of Proverbs. Rash words, it says, are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. I have to think that the Apostle Paul, good Jew that he was, knew those wise words when he added his own to them. Let no evil talk come out of your mouths, but only what is useful for building up, so that your words may offer grace. There may well be times in our lives and in our world when violence is unavoidable and even necessary as the least among evils. But violent words and actions are never ever to be a first resort. No, the first resort in your life and mine ought to be the same as Peter's was so long ago with Tabitha. For while our words will not resurrect the dead, our words always do have the power to build up instead of tear down, to be those of the helpers and not the violators, to bring new life and new hope. And when we seek to use our words in those ways, we will also find ourselves transformed. And we will thereby witness to a society that sometimes seems literally hell-bent on fear and demagoguery and violence. We will show the world that there is a better way. There is a better way. Thanks be to God, there is a better way.